June 3, 1944, 4:47. Somewhere in the Bavarian Alps. The dog's breath came in short clouds against the frozen air. A shepherd mix, 3 years old, brown and black with eyes that tracked every movement of the man who held the leash. The man's name was Unteroffizier Klaus Brenner, 24 years old, formerly a schoolteacher from Heidelberg, now standing in a stone courtyard surrounded by men in gray uniforms who watched him with the clinical attention of surgeons preparing an incision. The dog's name was Mila. She had been with him for 11 months. Brenner's hand trembled slightly as he reached down to touch the top of her head. She leaned into his palm, the way she always did, a gesture so automatic it had become a language between them. Trust rendered physical. The sky above was still dark, streaked with the faint violet bruise of approaching dawn. Somewhere beyond the wire fence that enclosed the training ground, a single bird began to sing. An officer stepped forward. His boots made no sound on the frost-rimed stones. He was tall, thin-faced, with the kind of calm that comes from certainty rather than peace. His name was Hauptmann Erich Voss, and he had trained 200 men in this facility over the past 18 months. He carried a clipboard though he never looked at it. He did not need to. He knew every name, every progression, every breaking point. Unteroffizier Brenner, Voss said quietly. His voice carried in the still air without rising above conversational tone. You understand the purpose of today's exercise. Brenner nodded. His throat felt tight as though something had lodged there during the night and refused to move. He had not slept. He had lain in his bunk staring at the wood grain of the ceiling, listening to the sound of Mila's breathing from her place beside his cot, trying to prepare himself for what he knew was coming and finding that preparation was a word without substance. Repeat the instruction, Voss said. Brenner's voice came out hoarse. To eliminate dependency. To prove that operational effectiveness is not compromised by emotional attachment. Correct. Voss stepped closer. His eyes were gray, the color of winter ice. You have been paired with this animal for nearly a year. In that time you have fed her, trained her, relied on her. She has become familiar, comfortable. A point of predictability in an unpredictable environment. He paused. This is a vulnerability. Do you understand why? Yes, sir. Explain. Brenner swallowed. The words had been drilled into him, repeated in lectures and manuals and late-night discussions in the barracks when men spoke in low voices about things they could not say during daylight. Attachment creates hesitation. Hesitation creates failure. In combat there is no room for sentiment. The soldier who cannot act without emotion is not a soldier. He is a liability. Precisely. Voss's expression did not change. You have been trained in marksmanship, field tactics, close combat, demolition. You are proficient in each. But proficiency is not the same as reliability. A weapon that jams under stress is useless. A man who jams under stress is worse than useless. He endangers those around him. Brenner said nothing. Mila sat at his side, her posture perfect, waiting for a command that had not yet come. She had learned to sit like this during their second week together, in a different courtyard, under different circumstances. He had rewarded her with dried meat and praise, and she had looked at him with something that resembled joy, if joy could exist in a place like this. Voss gestured toward a wooden post set into the ground 20 meters away. A length of rope hung from a metal ring embedded in the post. Secure the animal. Then return to the line. Brenner's fingers tightened around the leash. He could feel the leather worn smooth from months of handling, the small notch near the clip where it had caught on a fence during a training run in February. He could feel his pulse in his wrists, in his temples, a rhythm that seemed too fast and too slow at the same time. He walked forward. Mila walked beside him, her gait steady, trusting. She did not pull against the leash or look around nervously. She had learned that when Brenner moved, she moved with him, and that obedience brought consistency and consistency brought safety. When they reached the post, he clipped the leash to the ring. His hands were shaking now, visibly, and he clenched them into fists to stop the movement. Mila sat without being told. She watched him, her head tilted slightly to one side, a question forming in the space between her eyes and his. He did not answer it. He turned and walked back to the line where the other men stood. There were 6 of them, all with the same expression, the same tension in their shoulders, the same careful blankness in their faces. Each had gone through this before. Each had stood where Brenner now stood. Each had learned what he was about to learn. Voss handed him a pistol. A Walther P38 standard issue, the grip cold and heavy in his palm. Brenner checked the chamber automatically, a motion drilled into muscle memory, and found it loaded. 8 rounds. He would need only 1. At your discretion, Voss said. The courtyard was silent except for the wind moving through the pines beyond the fence. Brenner raised the pistol. His arm extended slowly, the barrel aligning with the post, with the shape sitting beside it. Mila watched him. She did not understand what the object in his hand meant. She understood only that he was there, and that he had always returned to her, and that this was another moment in a pattern of moments that had defined her short life. Brenner's finger found the trigger. The metal was cold. He could feel his heartbeat in his fingertip, a tiny percussion against the curve of steel. He thought about the first time he had seen her, a shivering puppy in a concrete kennel, chosen at random from a litter of 8 because the officer supervising intake had pointed and said, "That one." He thought about the nights she had slept beside his bunk, the warmth of her body a small anchor in a place where warmth was scarce. He thought about the morning she had alerted him to a tripwire during a field exercise, her low growl stopping him mid-step, saving him from injury or worse. He thought about the fact that none of this mattered. The shot was loud. It echoed off the stone walls and rolled out across the valley, startling the bird into silence. Mila's body jerked once and then went still. The rope hung slack. A small dark stain began to spread across the frost-covered ground. Brenner lowered the pistol. His hand was steady now. The trembling had stopped. He felt nothing, or he felt something so large and formless that it could not be named, could not be separated into component parts. He felt the way a room feels after a fire has burned through it, empty and changed and waiting for new purpose. Voss stepped forward and took the pistol. "Good," he said simply. "Return to barracks. Report to debrief at 0700. Brenner walked across the courtyard. He did not look at the post. He did not look at the shape beside it. He walked through the gate and down the gravel path and into the low stone building where the bunks were, and he sat on the edge of his cot and stared at the floor and waited for something to break inside him that had not yet broken. It did not come. Instead, there was only a strange, cold clarity, a sense that a door had closed and locked behind him and there was no key, no way back, only forward into whatever came next. This was the beginning. Not of the war, not of his service, but of something older and more fundamental. The transformation of a man into an instrument. The removal of the parts that hesitated, that questioned, that remembered what it meant to feel attachment without calculating its cost. He had killed what he loved. And in doing so, he had learned the first lesson of a particular kind of soldier, the kind who could be sent into the dark places where orders were carried out without witness and morality was a word spoken only by those who had never stood in a courtyard at dawn with a pistol in their hand and a choice that was not a choice. The mind is a landscape. It has terrain, elevation, hidden valleys where things grow that cannot be seen from the ridgeline. In peacetime, this landscape is stable, navigable, subject to the slow erosion of age and experience. In war, the landscape changes. New paths are cut. Old landmarks disappear. And in the specific crucible of military training designed to reshape human instinct, the landscape is not merely changed but actively sculpted, carved into a new configuration where survival depends on the suppression of everything that makes survival feel worth pursuing. This is not a story about cruelty for its own sake. It is a story about method. About the deliberate engineering of psychological transformation in service of tactical objectives. It is about the spaces between orders and execution, the invisible architecture of obedience, the mechanisms by which ordinary men are rendered capable of extraordinary acts. It is about Klaus Brenner, and what happened after the morning in the courtyard, and the long winding descent into a place where loyalty became indistinguishable from annihilation. The facility where Brenner trained was called Schwarzwald-Einheit, Black Forest Unit, though this name appeared on no official documents and was spoken aloud only by those who served within its perimeter. It occupied 11 acres of mountain forest in southern Bavaria, accessible by a single unpaved road that wound through dense pine and ended at a checkpoint manned day and night by armed guards who checked identification with the thoroughness of men who understood that secrecy was not merely policy but survival. The facility had been established in late 1942, at a moment when the war had begun its slow, grinding shift from expansion to attrition, when the calculus of victory had started to include variables that could not be solved by conventional force. The men who designed Schwarzwald-Einheit understood something that many field commanders did not, that the future of warfare would be fought not only with tanks and artillery but with the manipulation of perception, the exploitation of psychological vulnerabilities, the creation of soldiers who could operate behind lines, in occupied territory, in the gray spaces where conventional rules dissolved. These were not commandos in the traditional sense. They were not paratroopers or shock troops. They were specialists in a discipline that had no formal name, though later historians would call it psychological warfare, or deep infiltration, or simply black operations. They were trained to blend, to deceive, to build trust and then betray it, to move through civilian populations like smoke, invisible until the moment of action. And to do this work they needed to be remade. Brenner had arrived at Schwarzwald-Einheit in June of 1943, one of 32 men selected from various Wehrmacht and SS units based on criteria that were never fully explained. He had been teaching Latin and history at a gymnasium in Heidelberg when the war began, had enlisted in 1940 with a combination of patriotic fervor and intellectual curiosity, had served in France and Russia, had been wounded twice, lightly, and had been noticed by someone who reviewed personnel files looking for specific traits. Intelligence, discipline, a capacity for compartmentalization, no close family, no dependents, no ties that would create conflict when orders required actions that could not be reconciled with civilian morality. He did not know he had been noticed. He knew only that one day in May he had been summoned to an office in Berlin, interviewed by two men in civilian clothes who asked strange, oblique questions about his childhood, his relationships, his dreams, his fears, and who listened to his answers with the blank attention of entomologists observing insect behavior. 2 weeks later, he received orders to report to an address in Bavaria. No explanation. No context. Simply coordinates and a date. The first month had been standard. Physical conditioning. Weapons training. Field exercises. The usual rhythms of military preparation, familiar from his earlier service. But there had been subtle differences, small deviations that accumulated into a pattern. The instructors never shouted. They spoke in calm, measured tones, as though explaining geometry rather than methods of silent killing. The men were kept isolated, not in the brutal sense of punishment but in the structured sense of control. No mail. No leave. No contact with anyone outside the facility. And then, in July, the dogs. Each man was assigned an animal. The ostensible purpose was training in handling in the use of dogs for patrol and detection, skills that had practical battlefield application. But this was not the real purpose. The real purpose was revealed slowly, over weeks and months, through increments so gradual that resistance never had a moment to coalesce. First, they cared for the animals. Fed them. Cleaned their kennels. This created routine, responsibility. Then they trained them. Basic commands. Sit, stay, come, heel. This created communication, a shared language. Then they lived with them. The dogs were moved from kennels to barracks, allowed to sleep beside their handlers, to accompany them throughout the day. This created attachment. And attachment was the point. Because attachment was the target. The thing to be identified, isolated, and destroyed. Brenner had not understood this at first. He had thought the dog was simply part of the curriculum, another skill to be mastered. He had approached Mila with the same methodical focus he brought to marksmanship or hand-to-hand combat. He would learn what was necessary and move on. But Mila was not a skill. She was a living creature with patterns and preferences, with a personality that revealed itself over time. She disliked rain but loved snow. She was afraid of loud noises but courageous in the face of physical challenge. She had a way of resting her chin on his knee when she was tired, a gesture so small and specific that it felt like a secret between them. And over months something shifted. The methodical focus became something else. Care became affection. Routine became bond. He found himself thinking about her at odd moments, wondering if she was comfortable, if she was bored, if she missed him when he was away on exercises. He began to recognize her moods, her signals, the tilt of her ear that meant alertness, the softness in her eyes that meant contentment. He began to love her. This was the trap. The instructors watched. They documented. They measured. They noted the moments when a handler's attention lingered on his dog, when his voice softened giving commands, when he prioritized the animal's comfort over his own. They cataloged dependency, the slow accretion of emotional investment, the growing belief that the dog was not merely a tool but a companion. And when the attachment had matured, when it had become undeniable, they introduced the final exercise. The debrief took place in a small room with concrete walls and a single electric bulb hanging from the ceiling. Brenner sat in a wooden chair across from Hauptmann Voss, who made notes on a clipboard with a fountain pen that scratched quietly in the silence. There was no window. No clock. Time was whatever Voss decided it was. "How do you feel?" Voss asked. Brenner considered the question. He felt empty, scraped out, as though something vital had been removed and the space it left behind had not yet been filled with anything else. But he did not say this. He said, "I completed the task. That is not what I asked. I feel nothing." Voss looked up. His expression was neutral, clinical. Nothing is an answer. But it is not a precise answer. Nothing can mean shock, dissociation, denial, numbness as a defensive mechanism. Which do you mean? Brenner thought. The question forced him to examine the blankness inside himself, to probe it the way a tongue probes a missing tooth. "I don't know," he said finally. "That is acceptable. Clarity comes later. For now, I want you to describe what you experienced in the moments before you fired." Brenner spoke slowly, choosing words with care. "I thought about her. About Mila. About the time we spent. The training. He stopped. The word that wanted to come next was relationship, but that felt too human, too sentimental. He tried again. The connection. And I realized it didn't matter. That it was irrelevant. That the task was the task and my feelings about it were separate. That I could hold both at the same time. The memory of what she was to me, and the necessity of what I had to do." Voss wrote something down. "Good. That is the correct response. Not the elimination of feeling but the compartmentalization of it. The ability to act despite feeling. This is what separates effective operators from those who fail." He set the clipboard aside and leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Let me tell you something, Brenner. Every man in this facility has sat in this chair. Every man has completed this exercise. Some of them cried. Some of them vomited. One man refused. Do you know what happened to him?" Brenner shook his head. He was transferred to a penal battalion on the Eastern Front. He died 3 weeks later in a minefield. Not because he was a bad soldier but because he was unsuitable for this type of work. He could not separate action from attachment. He could not function in the gray spaces. And so he was sent somewhere where the rules were simple and the death was certain. Boss paused. You did not refuse. You hesitated but you did not refuse. That tells me you have the capacity for what comes next. The question is whether you have the will. What comes next? Brenner asked. Training continues. But now it is no longer theoretical. Now you understand what is required of you. Not in the abstract but in the specific. You know what it feels like to act against your own instinct, to override your own emotion in service of a larger objective. This is the foundation. Everything else builds from here. Brenner nodded slowly. He felt the weight of Voss's words settling into him, rearranging something in the architecture of his thoughts. A door closing. A path narrowing. One more question, Voss said. If you could go back to this morning knowing what you know now, would you make the same choice? Brenner did not hesitate this time. Yes. Why? Because the alternative is to fail. And failure is not acceptable. Voss smiled, a brief, cold expression that touched only his mouth. You are beginning to understand. In the weeks that followed, Brenner was given a new assignment. Not a dog this time but a role. A cover identity. A set of papers, a fictional background, a language he did not speak fluently but well enough to pass cursory inspection. He was to become a civilian, a displaced worker, a man with no allegiance visible on his sleeve. He was to move into a nearby town, take up residence, find employment, blend. The town was called Eisbach, a small logging community nestled in a valley 10 kilometers from the facility. Population 400. A single main street, a church, a school, a general store. The kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where newcomers were noted and discussed, where trust was earned slowly or not at all. Brenner's instructions were simple. Integrate. Become part of the town's fabric. Build relationships. Establish credibility. And then, when commanded, extract specific information from specific individuals without raising suspicion. This was the second phase of training. If the first phase had been about overriding attachment, the second was about weaponizing it. About learning to build trust deliberately, to simulate intimacy, to create bonds that could be exploited and then severed without hesitation. He arrived in Eisbach on a gray morning in late June, carrying a single suitcase and a set of forged documents that identified him as Johann Richter, a woodworker from Saxony displaced by bombing. He found lodging in a boarding house run by an elderly widow named Frau Kessler, who rented him a small room on the second floor and asked few questions beyond his ability to pay rent. He took a job at the sawmill on the edge of town, operating a planing machine, learning the rhythms of manual labor, the camaraderie of men who worked with their hands and spoke little. He was good at this, better than he expected. He found that his years of teaching had given him a skill he had not recognized, the ability to observe, to listen, to understand the unspoken currents that moved beneath conversation. He learned who was respected, who was feared, who was ignored. He learned the town's hierarchies, its alliances, its grudges. He learned who drank too much, who gossiped, who kept secrets. And he began to build relationships. There was a man named George, a foreman at the mill, who took a liking to Brenner because Brenner worked hard and did not complain. George invited him to join a card game at the tavern, introduced him to others, vouched for his character. There was a schoolteacher named Anna who taught at the local school and sometimes ate lunch at the boarding house, who shared Brenner's interest in books and began lending him novels from her small collection. There was the priest, Father Wilhelm, who welcomed him to services and invited him to help with repairs on the church roof. Each relationship was cultivated with care. Brenner listened more than he spoke. He offered help without asking for recognition. He was polite, deferential, forgettable in the way that allowed him to be present without being examined too closely. And once a week he left town under cover of darkness and returned to Schwarzwald-Einheit, where he reported to Voss and provided detailed accounts of everything he had learned. Names, relationships, vulnerabilities, information that had no apparent tactical value but that Voss recorded with the same clinical precision he had applied to everything else. Why am I doing this? Brenner asked during one of these debriefs. What is the point of learning that George's wife is having an affair, or that the priest has debts he cannot pay? Voss did not look up from his notes. Because information is leverage, and leverage is control. You are learning to see people not as individuals but as systems. As mechanisms with inputs and outputs. Emotions are inputs. Loyalty, fear, guilt, desire. If you understand the inputs, you can predict the outputs. You can manipulate them. To what end? That depends on the mission. Sometimes you need information. Sometimes you need action. Sometimes you need someone to disappear, and you need it to look like accident or coincidence, and you need a population to accept the explanation without question. To do any of this, you must first understand the system. And to understand the system, you must become part of it. Brenner absorbed this. It made sense in a cold, logical way, the same way that algebraic equations made sense once you understood the underlying principles. People were variables. Relationships were functions. Outcomes were calculable. But there was a tension growing inside him, a dissonance he could not quite name. The man he was in Eisbach, Johann Richter, the quiet woodworker, the helpful neighbor, felt increasingly real. The conversations he had, the small kindnesses he exchanged, the moments of laughter at the card table or shared silence during a meal, these were not entirely performative. Or rather, they had started as performance but had begun to shade into something else, something that blurred the line between mask and face. He liked George. He found Anna's company pleasant. He respected Father Wilhelm's earnestness. And this liking, this pleasure, this respect, these were not strategic. They were human. They were the residue of the man he had been before the courtyard, before the pistol, before the lesson in compartmentalization. And he did not know what to do with them. The mission came in August, 3 months after his arrival in Eisbach. He received the instruction during a late-night debrief at the facility, delivered by Voss in the same neutral tone he used for everything else. There is a man named Ernst Kohler. He lives in Eisbach. He is a saboteur working with partisan elements to disrupt supply lines. He is cautious, well hidden. We have been unable to locate him through conventional means. You will identify him, gain his trust, and arrange for his arrest. Brenner frowned. I don't know anyone named Ernst Kohler. That is not his real name. He is using an alias. He is one of the people you have met. One of the men in the town. Your task is to determine which one. How? By observation. By testing. By asking questions that seem innocent but reveal inconsistency. You have been taught these methods. Now you will apply them. Brenner felt a cold weight settle in his chest. And when I identify him? You will report to me. We will handle the rest. What will happen to him? Voss looked at him for a long moment. That is not your concern. Your concern is identification. Everything else is outside your scope. But Brenner knew. He knew what handle the rest meant. He had seen men disappear before, had heard the rumors of interrogations that ended in unmarked graves. He knew that Ernst Kohler, whoever he was, would not survive contact with the machinery that Voss represented. And one of the men Brenner had befriended, one of the people he had shared meals and conversations with, was about to be fed into that machinery because of information Brenner provided. He returned to Eisbach the next morning. The town looked the same as always, unchanged by the knowledge Brenner now carried. The mill operated. The church bell rang. Children played in the dirt streets. But everything felt different, viewed through the lens of his new task. Every man he encountered was a suspect. Every conversation was a potential clue. George the foreman. Friendly, open, with a loud laugh and a love of schnapps. But also a man who traveled frequently for work, who had contacts in other towns, who knew the schedules of supply trains. Father Wilhelm, the priest. Earnest, compassionate, trusted by everyone. A man who heard confessions, who knew secrets, who could move through the community without suspicion. Lucas, the tavern owner. Quiet, observant, a man who poured drinks and listened to talk, who saw who came and went, who had a ledger with names and debts and favors owed. There were others. The schoolteacher's brother, a mechanic who worked on vehicles. The shopkeeper's nephew, a delivery driver who moved goods between towns. Any of them could be Kohler. Any of them could be the one. Brenner began to test them. Small questions, casual comments, looking for gaps in their stories, inconsistencies in their timelines. He watched their reactions, their body language, the micro-expressions that betrayed stress or calculation. He was good at this. The training had given him tools and he used them with precision. But the process felt wrong in a way he could not articulate. Not morally wrong, though there was that too, but structurally wrong, as though he had been asked to solve a problem that should not have required solving. These men were not enemies. They were neighbors. They had welcomed him, trusted him, included him in their lives. And now he was dismantling those lives from the inside, looking for cracks, preparing to deliver someone to destruction. And the worst part was that he was succeeding. By mid-August he had narrowed the suspects to two. George and Father Wilhelm. Both had patterns that aligned with sabotage activity. Both had opportunities. Both had shown small, subtle signs of deception when questioned about their movements during key dates. He reported this to Voss, who listened without comment and then said, "Continue. Narrow it further. We need certainty." "What if I'm wrong?" Brenner asked. "Then an innocent man will suffer. But that is the cost of operational security. Better one innocent than allowing a saboteur to continue unchecked." "Is it?" Voss's eyes narrowed. "That is not a question you are permitted to ask. Your role is execution, not judgment. Do you understand?" Brenner nodded. But he did not understand. Or rather, he understood too well. He understood that the machinery he served did not care about truth or justice or the value of individual lives. It cared only about results, about the smooth functioning of the system, about the elimination of threats whether real or imagined. And he understood that he was part of that machinery now. That he had been remade, reshaped, turned into an instrument that could be pointed at targets and expected to function without question. But he also understood that something inside him was breaking. Not breaking in the sudden, catastrophic way of a bone snapping, but in the slow, erosive way of stone worn down by water. The compartmentalization that had worked in the courtyard with Mila, the ability to separate action from feeling, was failing. Because Mila had been a dog and these were men. Men with families. With histories. With futures that would be erased because Brenner had observed them too well, had asked the right questions, had done his job. He did not sleep that night. He lay in his narrow bed in the boarding house and listened to the sounds of the town settling into darkness, doors closing, voices fading, the distant bark of a dog, and he thought about George's laugh, about Father Wilhelm's kindness, about the way Anna had smiled when she lent him a book and said she hoped he would enjoy it. He thought about the fact that he was going to betray one of them. And he thought about the fact that he was going to do it anyway. The final identification came 2 weeks later. Father Wilhelm. A pattern of absences that coincided with sabotage events. A visitor late at night, seen leaving the church by a route that avoided the main street. A small, inconsistent detail in a story about travel to a nearby parish. Brenner reported it to Voss with a voice that felt like it belonged to someone else. Voss nodded. Good work. We will move tonight. You are not required to be present for the arrest. What will happen to him? He will be interrogated. If he provides useful intelligence, he will be sent to a labor camp. If not, Voss shrugged. The war requires difficult choices. You have made yours. You should feel no guilt for doing your duty. But Brenner did feel guilt. It pressed against him from all sides, heavy and suffocating, a weight that could not be set down. He left the facility and walked back toward Eisbach, moving slowly through the forest, and he thought about turning around. About warning Father Wilhelm. About undoing the work he had done. But he did not turn around. Because he knew that if he did, he would be the one arrested. The one interrogated. The one sent to a penal battalion or a camp or a grave. The machinery did not tolerate betrayal. It only tolerated function. And so he kept walking. That night as he lay in his bed, he heard the trucks. The sound of engines in the street, boots on cobblestones, a door being broken open, shouts, a single scream cut short. He lay still and listened and felt something inside him harden into a shape that had no name, a coldness that was not numbness but something worse, something like the acceptance of his own corruption. Father Wilhelm was gone by morning. The town buzzed with confusion and fear. Gestapo people whispered. Collaborators. Enemies of the Reich. No one knew the truth. No one suspected Brenner, the quiet woodworker, the helpful stranger. He went to work at the mill. He played cards at the tavern. He attended church the following Sunday and listened to a visiting priest speak about faith and perseverance. And he felt nothing. Or he felt everything, a formless mass of emotion that he could not untangle into component parts, could not process, could not name. He had learned to kill what he loved. And in doing so he had killed something inside himself. The months that followed were a blur. Brenner was pulled from Eisbach and sent on other missions. Other towns. Other identities. Other targets. Each one followed the same pattern. Infiltration. Integration. Identification. Extraction. He became efficient. Precise. Reliable. Voss praised his work. He was promoted. He was given more responsibility, more complex assignments, more autonomy. And with each mission the coldness inside him grew. It was not that he stopped feeling. It was that the feelings became detached from action, stored in a separate compartment that opened only in rare, unguarded moments. Late at night. In dreams. In the space between waking and sleep when the defenses were down and the accumulated weight of his actions pressed against him like a hand on his chest. He dreamed about Mila. About the courtyard. About the sound of the shot echoing off stone walls. He dreamed about Father Wilhelm, about George's laugh, about Anna's smile. He dreamed about the people he had betrayed, the lives he had dismantled, the trust he had exploited. And in the dreams, they looked at him with the same expression Mila had worn in the moment before he fired. A question. A confusion. A betrayal so fundamental that it could not be understood, only endured. But during the day he functioned. He moved through his assignments with the smooth efficiency of a well-oiled machine. He became what the facility had designed him to be. A weapon. A tool. An instrument of the state's will, pointed at targets and expected to deliver outcomes without error or hesitation. He was, by all measures, a success. And this success felt like dying. The psychological mechanisms at work in places like Schwarzwald-Einheit were not new. They had roots in older traditions, older understandings of how human beings could be shaped and reshaped through controlled application of stress, reward, and isolation. The military science of the 20th century had simply systematized these mechanisms, turned them from art into engineering. The process began with selection. Not everyone was suitable for this kind of work. The men who arrived at facilities like Schwarzwald-Einheit had been screened, tested, evaluated. They possessed certain traits. High intelligence but not genius, which tended toward independence. Strong discipline but not rigidity, which could not adapt. a capacity for empathy which was necessary to read and manipulate others, but also a capacity for detachment, which was necessary to act without being paralyzed by the consequences of action. They were, in short, men who could be trusted to follow orders and improvise simultaneously, who could hold contradictory imperatives in balance, who could care and not care at the same time. Once selected, they were placed into a carefully constructed environment that stripped away external identity. No mail, no contact with family, no news from the outside world. Time became measured only by the facility's schedule. Space became limited to the compound's perimeter. The self, deprived of external reference points, began to reorganize around internal ones. And the internal ones were provided by the training itself. This was the first transformation. The creation of dependency not on family or friends or civilian society, but on the unit, the instructors, the mission. The men became each other's context. Their worth was measured only by their performance within the facility's parameters. Success brought approval. Failure brought isolation. The feedback loop was immediate, consistent, inescapable. Then came the introduction of attachment. The dogs were ideal for this purpose. They required care but offered no judgment. They responded to training with visible progress. They provided companionship without complexity. And unlike human relationships, which developed slowly and unpredictably, the bond between handler and animal could be accelerated, intensified, made dependable through simple behavioral reinforcement. The instructors knew exactly how long it took. 3 months on average. 3 months of daily interaction, of routine and reward, of small accumulated moments that built into something larger. 3 months for a man to begin thinking of the animal not as equipment but as a living creature with value independent of its utility. And then, when the attachment was at its peak, when the bond felt natural and necessary, came the elimination exercise. This was not cruelty. Or rather, it was not cruelty for its own sake. It was surgical. The point was not to traumatize but to teach. To demonstrate, in the most visceral way possible, that attachment was a liability. That the ability to act against one's own emotions was not merely desirable but essential. That the soldier who could not pull the trigger when the target wore a familiar face was a soldier who would fail when it mattered most. The men who completed the exercise learned this lesson on multiple levels. Consciously, they learned that orders superseded feelings. Unconsciously, they learned that attachment itself was dangerous, that caring was a vulnerability to be avoided or at least controlled. They learned to create distance even as they created proximity, to simulate intimacy without experiencing it fully, to treat relationships as temporary and instrumental. They learned, in short, to function as human beings while suppressing the parts of humanity that interfered with function. This was the architecture of the training. And it worked. The men who graduated from Schwarzwald-Einheit were extraordinarily effective. They could infiltrate, deceive, extract information, eliminate targets, all while maintaining cover identities that appeared natural and unremarkable. They were ghosts, moving through occupied territories and resistance networks and civilian populations, invisible until the moment they acted. But there was a cost. The cost was not immediately visible. It did not manifest in the field, where focus and adrenaline kept the machinery running smoothly. It manifested later, in the spaces between missions, in the quiet moments when the mind was no longer occupied with immediate threats and began to process what it had experienced. Some men drank. Some men sought out violence in contexts where it was permitted, even encouraged. Some men simply shut down, became hollow, automata going through motions without connection to their own actions. And some men, like Brenner, began to fracture. Not cleanly, not obviously, but in subtle ways that accumulated over time. A slippage between the performed self and the actual self. A growing sense that the person he had been before the training was unreachable, a memory of someone else's life. A feeling that he was watching himself from outside, observing his own actions with a mixture of recognition and alienation. The psychiatrists who occasionally visited the facility to evaluate the men had terms for this. Dissociation. Depersonalization. Moral injury. But these were clinical terms, abstract, insufficient to capture the lived experience of being unmade and remade, of having your instincts rewired, your emotional responses recalibrated, your sense of self subordinated to operational necessity. Brenner did not have the language for what was happening to him. He knew only that something was wrong. That the cold clarity he felt during missions was not strength but the absence of something essential. That the ability to act without hesitation was not competence but damage. And he knew that he could not stop. Because stopping meant failure. And failure meant punishment. And punishment in this context did not mean demotion or reprimand. It meant death, or worse, the kind of death that came slowly in a penal battalion on the Eastern Front where life expectancy was measured in days. So he continued. In October of 1944, Brenner was sent to Munich. The mission parameters were more complex than previous assignments. He was to infiltrate a network of university students suspected of producing and distributing anti-war pamphlets. The network was sophisticated, well-compartmented, with multiple layers of operational security. Traditional interrogation had failed to penetrate it. What was needed was someone on the inside, someone who could gain trust, identify the network structure, and provide the information necessary for a comprehensive sweep. Brenner arrived under the identity of a medical student named Paul Wegner, recently transferred from Berlin after his university had been damaged in a bombing raid. He carried forged transcripts, letters of recommendation, a carefully constructed paper trail that would withstand scrutiny. He enrolled in courses, found lodging in a boarding house near the university, began the slow work of integration. Munich was different from the small towns where he had operated before. It was larger, more anonymous, more dangerous. The bombing had intensified. Air raid sirens punctuated the nights. Rubble lined the streets. There was a pervasive atmosphere of exhaustion and fear, but also a strange defiance, a refusal to surrender to the inevitable. The university itself was a shadow of what it had been. Many faculty had left. Many students had been conscripted. Those who remained were a mix of the exempted, the medically unfit, the politically connected, the essential, and the quietly resistant, those who had found ways to avoid service while maintaining a facade of compliance. Brenner attended lectures. He studied. He played the role of a diligent student preoccupied with anatomy and physiology, uninterested in politics, focused on completing his degree and returning to some semblance of normal life. He was, in short, unremarkable. And because he was unremarkable, he was safe. People spoke around him without caution. They complained about the war, about rationing, about losses. Not openly, not in ways that would attract attention from informers, but in small, bitter asides, the kind of talk that happens when exhaustion outweighs fear. He listened. He catalogued. He identified patterns in who spoke to whom, who gathered in small groups after lectures, who exchanged glances or brief words that suggested shared knowledge. And slowly he identified his targets. There were 3 of them at the core. A medical student named Sophie, 21 years old, with dark hair and serious eyes and a quiet intensity that drew people to her. Her brother Hans, 24, a philosophy student with a talent for rhetoric and a network of contacts across the university. And their friend Christoph, a physics student, cautious and analytical, who served as the group's logistical coordinator. Brenner watched them for weeks. He noted their routines, their associates, their vulnerabilities. Sophie was passionate, driven by moral conviction, willing to take risks that others would not. Hans was charismatic, persuasive, able to inspire loyalty. Christoph was careful, methodical, the one who planned operations and minimized exposure. Together they were formidable. Separately they could be isolated, exploited, broken. Brenner's point of entry was Sophie. He engineered a meeting that appeared accidental, a collision in a hallway that sent her books scattering. He helped her gather them, apologized profusely, introduced himself. She was polite but distant, the practiced distance of someone who knew better than to trust easily. But he persisted. He appeared in the same places she did, always with a plausible reason, never forcing interaction but making himself available. He offered to loan her notes from a lecture she had missed. He shared food from a care package his fictional mother had sent. He asked careful, intelligent questions about coursework that established him as thoughtful but not threatening. And gradually, over weeks, she began to relax around him, to include him in conversations, to laugh at his occasional dry humor, to see him as a peer, someone navigating the same difficulties, someone who could be trusted. The process felt familiar. He had done this before in Eisbach, in other towns. The mechanisms were the same. Build rapport. Establish commonality. Create the impression of shared values. Wait for the target to lower their defenses. But there was a difference this time. Sophie was not like George or Father Wilhelm. She was younger, sharper, more guarded. She had been trained, in her own way, to recognize manipulation. She tested him, asked questions designed to reveal inconsistency, watched for signs of deception. And Brenner had to be perfect. Not just competent but flawless. Because the stakes were higher. The network she was part of was not a handful of saboteurs in a remote town. It was a structured resistance with reach and resources. If he failed, if he was exposed, he would not simply be reassigned. He would be eliminated, and his failure would compromise the entire operation. So he was perfect. He became Paul Wegner so completely that he almost believed it himself. He attended lectures and took notes and worried about exams. He complained about the rationing and the bombings. He expressed weariness with the war, not in a way that suggested disloyalty but in the way that everyone expressed weariness, a generalized exhaustion that could not be avoided. And Sophie began to trust him. The breakthrough came in November. Sophie invited him to a small gathering, a birthday party for one of the students in their cohort. It was held in a cramped apartment, lit by candles because the power was out, heated by a small stove that barely took the edge off the cold. There were perhaps a dozen people, sitting on floors and furniture, passing around a bottle of wine that had been saved for the occasion. Brenner sat quietly and observed. He noted who was present, who spoke to whom, the subtle hierarchies and relationships. He noted that Hans and Christoph were there, that they watched him with the careful attention of people evaluating a stranger. And he noted that the conversation, which began with safe topics, classes, professors, shortages, gradually shifted to darker territory. Someone made a joke about the propaganda posters plastered around the city. Someone else mentioned a friend who had been arrested for listening to a foreign radio broadcast. The tone was light, but the subtext was not. These were people testing boundaries, seeing how far they could speak freely, gauging who could be trusted. Brenner said little. He laughed at the jokes. He nodded at the complaints. He offered no opinions that could mark him as either zealously loyal or dangerously critical. He was neutral, safe, forgettable. But Sophie was watching him. He felt her eyes on him several times throughout the evening, assessing, measuring. And when the gathering broke up and people began to leave, she stopped him at the door. "Walk with me," she said. They walked through the dark streets, past rubble and shuttered shops and buildings with windows blown out and covered with boards. The city was quiet except for the distant sound of sirens and the occasional rumble of an aircraft overhead. Sophie walked with her hands in her coat pockets, her breath visible in the cold air. "What do you think about the war?" she asked after a long silence. The question was direct, unadorned. A test. Brenner considered his answer carefully. Too enthusiastic a response would mark him as a loyalist, someone who could not be trusted. Too critical a response would seem suspicious, the kind of provocation an informer might use to elicit incriminating statements. He needed balance. "I think it's a tragedy," he said finally. "I think it's necessary, or I'm told it's necessary, but I don't know if I believe that anymore. I think a lot of people are dying for reasons that aren't clear to me. And I think saying that out loud is dangerous, which is why I don't say it out loud." Sophie looked at him. "But you just did. Do you? Which means I'm either trusting you or I'm very stupid." A small smile touched her lips. "Or both." They walked further. Brenner waited. He did not push. The silence stretched, comfortable, the kind that exists between people who do not feel the need to fill every moment with words. Finally, Sophie spoke again. "There are people who think differently. Who think the war is wrong. Who think what's being done in the name of the nation is monstrous. Who think silence is complicity. I've heard rumors," Brenner said carefully. "Rumors are dangerous. Yes. But sometimes truth is more dangerous than rumors." Brenner stopped walking. He turned to face her. "Why are you telling me this?" Sophie met his eyes. "Because I think you're the kind of person who already knows. Who sees what's happening and chooses not to look away. And I think you're tired of pretending." It was a recruitment pitch. Subtle, indirect, deniable if necessary. She was offering him access to the network, testing whether he would accept, whether he would reveal himself as sympathetic or hostile. This was the moment. The fulcrum. Everything he had built over the past month came down to this. Brenner felt something twist inside him. A conflict. Because part of him, the part that was still Klaus Brenner, still the man who had stood in a courtyard and killed Mila, still the man who had identified Father Wilhelm, knew exactly what he was supposed to do. Accept the offer. Gain access. Gather names and details and operational information. Report to his handlers. Watch the network be dismantled and its members arrested and executed. But another part of him, a part he had thought was dead or at least deeply buried, rebelled. Because he looked at Sophie and saw not a target but a person. A young woman with conviction and courage, trying to do something she believed was right in a world where doing the right thing meant death. He saw someone who had chosen to resist even though resistance was futile, who had decided that speaking truth was worth the cost, who had not yet learned the lesson he had learned in the courtyard. That attachment is weakness, that caring is vulnerability, that the only way to survive is to stop feeling. And he thought, she's going to die because of me. Not might. Not probably. But certainly. Inevitably. Because that was his function. That was what he had been made to do. And for the first time since the courtyard, he asked himself the question he had been trained not to ask. Is this right? Not strategically. Not tactically. Not in terms of operational objectives or mission parameters. But morally. Fundamentally. In the basic calculus of human worth and human cost. And he did not know the answer. "I'm tired of pretending," he heard himself say. Sophie nodded slowly. "So are we." The integration into the network happened gradually. Sophie did not immediately introduce him to Hans or Christoph or reveal the full scope of their activities. Instead, she brought him into the periphery. Small tasks. Delivering a package to an address across the city. Keeping watch while others met. Helping to distribute pamphlets in the early morning hours when the streets were empty. Brenner performed these tasks with the same precision he brought to everything. But now there was a strange duality to his actions. On the surface, he was deepening his cover, gaining access, building trust so that he could fulfill his mission. But underneath, something else was happening. He was experiencing the work itself, not as an observer but as a participant. He read the pamphlets he distributed, saw the arguments they made about the moral bankruptcy of the regime, the necessity of resistance, the responsibility of ordinary people to refuse complicity. And the arguments made sense. Not in a way that overrode his training, but in a way that existed alongside it, creating dissonance, friction, a grinding feeling inside his mind like gears that no longer meshed properly. He was, simultaneously, an infiltrator working to destroy the network and a member of the network working to undermine the regime. He held both identities at once and neither felt entirely real and both felt suffocating. He reported to his handlers. A brief meeting in a safe house on the outskirts of the city, where he provided details about Sophie, Hans, Christoph, the structure of their operations. The handler, a man named Richter, listened and took notes and said that the information was valuable, that the sweep would happen soon, that Brenner should continue to embed himself and prepare for extraction when the order came. Brenner nodded. He said nothing about the conflict inside him. He had learned long ago that expressing doubt was synonymous with failure, and failure was not tolerated. But the conflict grew. It grew because the people in the network were not abstractions. They were individuals with histories and dreams and families. Hans talked about his sister with affection and frustration the way siblings do. Christoph mentioned a girl he had loved who had died in a bombing raid, and how her death had clarified for him what mattered and what did not. Sophie spoke about her father, a veteran of the First War, who had taught her to question authority, to think independently, to hold on to her humanity even when the world demanded otherwise. These were not enemies. They were not saboteurs or traitors in any meaningful sense. They were people who had decided that silent complicity was worse than speaking out, even if speaking out meant death. And Brenner was going to kill them. Not directly. Not with his own hands. But through the information he provided, through the machinery he served, through the arrests and interrogations and executions that would follow. He had done this before. He had delivered Father Wilhelm. He had delivered others whose names he no longer remembered. It had been difficult, but he had done it because that was his function, his purpose, the reason he had been trained and deployed. But now it felt different. Perhaps it was because Munich was a city larger and more complex, and the stakes felt higher. Perhaps it was because Sophie reminded him of someone, a student he had taught in Heidelberg, bright and earnest and doomed by history. Perhaps it was because he was tired, worn down by the accumulated weight of missions and betrayals and compartmentalized guilt that had begun to leak from its designated storage. Or perhaps it was because he had finally reached the limit of what could be done to a human being before the machinery broke. In December, the network planned a major action. A distribution of pamphlets across the university campus, timed to coincide with a speech by a visiting party official. It was bold, risky, the kind of operation that would attract attention and possibly lead to arrest. Hans argued for it passionately. Christoph was hesitant but agreed to the logistics. Sophie supported it, saying that the time for caution had passed, that if they did not act now they would lose the will to act at all. Brenner was asked to participate, to help with the distribution, to serve as a lookout, to be part of the coordinated effort that would require a dozen people working simultaneously across multiple buildings. He agreed. And then he reported the plan to Richter. Richter was pleased. Perfect. We'll let them proceed. Catch them in the act. Arrest everyone involved. This will dismantle the entire network in one operation. Brenner felt something cold settle in his stomach. Everyone? Everyone. That's the point. Make an example. Show what happens to those who resist. What about me? When do I extract? During the arrest. You'll be taken into custody with the others, then quietly released. Standard procedure. Brenner nodded. The plan made sense. It was clean, efficient, operationally sound. And it meant that Sophie, Hans, Christoph, and everyone else in the network would be arrested, interrogated, and almost certainly executed. He left the meeting and walked through the cold streets, hands in his pockets, mind churning. He had hours to decide. Hours to choose between following his orders and doing something else, something that would constitute betrayal, insubordination, treason. Because he could warn them. He could tell Sophie that the operation was compromised, that they needed to abort, that someone had informed. He would not need to reveal himself as the informer. He could claim to have overheard something, to have seen something suspicious, to have a bad feeling. It would be enough to stop the operation, to save their lives at least for now. But if he did that, his mission would fail. And failure would lead to questions, investigations, suspicion, eventually exposure. And then his own arrest, his own interrogation, his own death. The choice was binary. Obey and survive or betray and die. Except it was not that simple. Because Brenner realized, walking through those cold streets with rubble on either side and sirens wailing in the distance, that survival was not the same as living. That he had been surviving for a long time, had been functioning, performing, executing missions, but had not been alive in any way that mattered. He had become a hollow thing, a mechanism, a tool that thought and breathed but had no core, no center, no self beyond the roles he played. He had killed what he loved. And in doing so he had killed the part of himself that could love. And now, faced with the choice to kill again or refuse, he found that he could not. Not because of courage or moral clarity or sudden revelation, but because he was broken. The machinery had finally failed. The compartments had collapsed. The walls he had built to separate action from feeling had crumbled, and everything was flooding together, and he could not pretend anymore that what he did not matter. He could not save himself. That option had closed the moment he shot Mila, The moment he identified Father Wilhelm, the moment he accepted the first mission and stepped onto the path that led here. But he could save them. The night before the planned distribution, Brenner met Sophie in a small cafe near the university. She was nervous, excited, her energy barely contained. She talked about the pamphlets, about the message they carried, about the hope that someone might read them and think differently, might question what they had been told, might resist in whatever small way they could. "Do you think it will make a difference?" she asked. Brenner looked at her across the small table. "I don't know. Maybe. Maybe not. But it matters that you're trying. That's what Hans says. That trying is enough. That we can't control outcomes, only our own actions." "He's right." Sophie smiled. "You've changed, Paul. When you first arrived you seemed distant, careful. But lately you're different. More present." Brenner felt a tightness in his chest. "Maybe I'm just tired of being careful." "Good. We need people who are willing to take risks." "Sophie," he said and then stopped. He did not know how to continue. How to say what needed to be said without revealing too much. "What is it?" "Be careful tomorrow. Something feels wrong." Her smile faded. "Wrong how?" "I don't know. Just be careful. Have a backup plan. If anything seems off, abort. Promise me." She studied his face. "You know something." "I don't. I just have a feeling." "Feelings are often right. Then trust mine." She reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "I will. Thank you, Paul." Brenner held her hand for a moment, feeling the warmth of her skin, the trust she had placed in him. Then he let go and stood and left the cafe, knowing he would not see her again. He returned to his boarding house. He sat on the edge of his narrow bed. And he wrote. He wrote down everything. Every mission he had been sent on. Every person he had identified. Every betrayal. The training at Schwarzwald-Einheit. The exercise with Mila. The methods used to create soldiers like him. The names of his handlers. The locations of safe houses. The structure of the infiltration network. He wrote it in small, precise handwriting on thin paper, filling page after page, documenting everything he could remember. And when he was finished, he sealed the pages in an envelope and addressed it to a contact he knew only by reputation, a journalist with allied connections who might be able to get the information out, might be able to expose the machinery, might be able to save others from becoming what he had become. He did not know if the letter would reach its destination. Probably it would not. Probably it would be intercepted, destroyed, ignored. But he wrote it anyway because it was the only action he could take that felt like resistance rather than compliance, like choice rather than compulsion. Then he went to sleep. Or he lay in bed with his eyes closed, drifting in and out of something that resembled sleep but offered no rest, waiting for dawn. The distribution happened as planned. Brenner arrived at the university early, took his assigned position, watched Hans and Christoph and Sophie move through the buildings with their stacks of pamphlets, placing them in bathrooms and on desks and in hallways where students would find them. The security forces arrived within minutes. Not campus police. Gestapo. Dozens of them, moving with coordinated precision, blocking exits, checking identifications, searching bags. The sweep was total, overwhelming, designed to catch everyone involved before they could scatter. Brenner was arrested along with the others. Hands roughly pulled behind his back, cuffs snapping shut, shoved toward a waiting truck. He saw Sophie being led out of a building, her face pale but composed. He saw Hans arguing with an officer, his voice rising in anger before a blow silenced him. He saw Christoph standing quietly, resigned, as though he had always known this moment would come. They were loaded into trucks, driven to a facility on the outskirts of the city, separated into cells. Brenner waited for someone to come for him. For Richter or another handler to appear and quietly extract him as planned. No one came. Hours passed. Then a day. Then 2 days. And Brenner began to understand. They were not going to extract him. Not because they could not, but because they had decided not to. Because he had become a liability. Because his warning to Sophie, however subtle, had been noticed. Because someone had reviewed his reports and found them slightly too detailed, slightly too sympathetic, slightly off in a way that suggested compromise. Or because they simply did not need him anymore. The network was dismantled. The mission was complete. He had served his purpose. And maintaining the fiction of his cover identity, arranging his extraction, ensuring his survival, all of this required effort and resources that could be better spent elsewhere. He was expendable. He had always been expendable. He sat in his cell and felt a strange calm settle over him. Not peace, but the absence of struggle. He had made his choice. He had written the letter. He had tried to warn them. It had not been enough, but it had been something, and something was better than nothing. He thought about Mila. About the courtyard. About the moment when he had pulled the trigger and felt the world shift into a new configuration. He thought about Father Wilhelm, about George, about all the others whose names he no longer remembered. He thought about the machinery that had taken him and reshaped him and used him and discarded him. And he thought about Sophie's hand across the table, warm and trusting, and the way she had smiled when she talked about trying, about making a difference, about refusing to be silent. He had failed her. He had failed all of them. But perhaps, in the final accounting, failure was its own kind of success. Because he had tried. At the end, when it mattered most, he had chosen resistance over compliance. He had broken the machinery, or at least refused to keep functioning within it. And that was something. The interrogations began on the third day. Brenner was pulled from his cell and taken to a room with concrete walls and a single light bulb and a chair bolted to the floor. A man in a dark suit sat across from him, smoking a cigarette, reviewing a file. "Paul Wegner," the man said. "Or should I call you Klaus Brenner?" So they knew. Of course they knew. "Either is fine," Brenner said. "You were one of ours. Schwarzwald-Einheit. Trained in infiltration and intelligence gathering. Sent to Munich to penetrate a resistance network." "Yes. You succeeded. You provided detailed reports. Valuable information. And then you sabotaged your own operation." Brenner said nothing. "Why?" The man leaned forward. "You could have extracted. You could have completed the mission cleanly. Instead you warned them. You compromised everything. Why?" Brenner thought about how to answer. There were so many reasons, layered and tangled and impossible to separate. Exhaustion. Guilt. The accumulated weight of betrayals. The sight of Sophie's smile. The memory of Mila's eyes. The realization that he had become something monstrous and the decision, however futile, to stop being that thing. But he said only, "Because I was tired of killing what I loved." The man stared at him. "That makes no sense." "No," Brenner agreed. "It doesn't." The interrogation continued. Questions about the network, about other cells, about contacts and communication methods. Brenner answered truthfully when the answers did not matter, lied when they did. Not to protect himself, he knew protection was impossible, but to protect anyone who might still be free, anyone who might escape the machinery's reach. The man grew frustrated. Violence was implied, then applied. Brenner endured it with the same detached calm he had brought to everything else. Pain was just another input, another sensation to be compartmentalized and set aside. Eventually the sessions ended. He was returned to his cell. And he waited. The trial was brief, perfunctory, a formality required by bureaucratic procedure but devoid of actual judicial process. Brenner was charged with treason, with aiding enemies of the Reich, with sabotaging military operations. No defense was permitted. No evidence was examined. The verdict was delivered before the proceedings began. Guilty. Sentence, death. He was returned to his cell to await execution. The date was set for January 15, 1945. He had 2 weeks. He spent them in silence. He was not permitted visitors. He was not permitted writing materials. He had only the bare space of his cell, the thin mattress, the bucket in the corner, the small window set high in the wall that admitted a rectangle of gray light. He thought about his life. About the man he had been before the war, the teacher who had loved books and ideas and the challenge of helping young minds discover the world's complexity. About the man he had become during the war, the soldier who had learned to kill without hesitation, to betray without remorse, to function as a tool in service of aims he did not choose. About the man he had been at the end, broken and compromised but trying, however inadequately, to reclaim some fragment of his humanity. He wondered if the letter had reached its destination. He would never know. But he hoped. It was a small hope, fragile, probably futile, but it was all he had. He thought about Sophie and Hans and Christoph. He did not know what had happened to them. He assumed they had been executed or would be soon. He hoped it had been quick, painless, though he knew hope was probably misplaced. He thought about Mila. Always Mila. The courtyard. The frost on the ground. The sound of the shot. The way her body had jerked and gone still. He had learned to kill what he loved. And in the end what he loved was himself. The self he had been, the self he might have become, the self that was buried beneath layers of training and trauma and compromise. He had killed that self in the courtyard, or he had thought he had, but it had persisted, hidden, waiting, and at the end it had surfaced long enough to refuse. To say no. To stop functioning. And that refusal had killed him. But it had also saved him. Not his life, that was already forfeit, but something more fundamental. Some essential core that defined what it meant to be human rather than machine, a person rather than a tool, a being with agency and choice and the capacity to say, "I will not." The execution took place at dawn. He was led from his cell down a long corridor to a courtyard. Not the same courtyard where he had shot Mila, but similar. Stone walls. Cold air. The faint violet light of approaching sunrise. There were others. 8 prisoners lined up along a wall. Brenner was placed among them. A firing squad assembled opposite, a line of men in uniform holding rifles, their faces blank, their postures mechanical. An officer read the charges. Treason. Sabotage. Aiding enemies of the Reich. The words were familiar, formulaic, drained of meaning through repetition. Brenner looked at the sky. It was clear, pale blue shading to gold at the horizon. A bird flew overhead, small and dark against the brightening air. He watched it until it disappeared beyond the wall. He thought about nothing. where he thought about everything, a rushing cascade of images and memories and sensations that could not be organized into coherent narrative. Mila, Sophie, the courtyard, the classroom in Heidelberg, the faces of students listening as he explained Cicero, the smell of rain, the taste of wine, the feeling of a book in his hands, the sound of laughter, all of it collapsing into a single point, a moment, this moment, the last moment, the ending of everything he had been and everything he might have been. The officer gave the command. The rifles rose. Brenner closed his eyes. He heard the shots, felt the impact. A strange, distant sensation as though happening to someone else, somewhere else in a different story. And then nothing.